Long before the sweet smell of spiced cookies filled winter kitchens, stories were already circulating of figures made from bread and honey that could come to life. According to legend, a ritual loaf shaped like a man once walked off a temple altar in a faraway land. Whether that tale was metaphor or memory, it planted an idea that would survive 3,000 years, traveling through cultures, religions, and continents until it arrived on our plates as the Gingerbread Man. Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient marketplace, the air thick with resin, cinnamon, and smoke. Merchants chant prices of rare spices brought by caravan. Bakers knead dough sweetened with honey and date syrup, pressing it into wooden molds carved with human shapes. Children watch as these figures emerge from ovens, crisp at the edges, and then are offered at festivals not as mere treats, but as edible charms, tiny, fragrant stand-ins for spirits of fertility, courage, or luck. This is the world from which our modern cookie quietly descends. Archaeologists have found traces of molded bread figurines in tombs along the Nile and in the ash of Mesopotamian hearths. Clay stamps from 1500 BCE show little men with arms outstretched, sometimes with animal heads, sometimes holding staffs. These were not toys, they were offerings, eaten after ritual or left to crumble as symbols of renewal. In the cool storerooms of museums today, you can still see faint impressions of these ancient molds, bodies without eyes, torsos with geometric swirls, echoes of a forgotten recipe. Across Europe's prehistoric north, in burial mounds and bogs, small effigies made of grain paste appear again. Some are tied to solstice feasts, others to harvest rites. Folklorists note a curious pattern. In each tradition, the figure embodies more than food. It is a message, a story of transformation, grain into bread, dough into man, man into spirit. The boundary between nourishment and myth dissolves with every bite. Even in early Greek festivals, sacrificial cakes, called pelenoi, were shaped like animals or people and burned or shared among worshippers. Roman libum cakes offered to household gods sometimes bore human imprints. When northern tribes encountered these customs through trade and conquest, they added their own flavors, ginger, pepper, cloves from the east, and their own tales of animated bread men escaping the oven, defying their makers. By the Middle Ages, the legend had already crossed languages and religions, waiting for the name we know today. What we call the Gingerbread Man carries in its crumbs a story of migration, ritual, and reinvention. Behind its cheerful face lies a network of myths older than most written texts, myths that once told farmers when to sow, soldiers when to march, and families how to honor their dead. This documentary will follow that hidden trail, from temple ovens to medieval fairs, from folk songs to children's books, uncovering how a simple spiced cookie became a vessel of memory. It begins here with a mystery. Why would cultures separated by seas and centuries all create little edible people? Was it simply novelty? Or did they believe that eating a symbol gave them its power? And how did a once sacred effigy turn into a nursery tale of a runaway cookie? These are the questions that guide our journey through 3 millennia of legend and spice. To trace the first crumbs of the Gingerbread Man's journey, we need to step back into a world where bread was not just food, but the very fabric of life. In ancient Egypt, grain was currency, ritual, and sustenance. Bakers worked near temples and palaces, and certain festivals required bread shaped into animals or people. According to inscriptions on tomb walls, these loaves were blessed and then either offered to the gods or consumed by priests and families in rites of renewal. Archaeologists have recovered hardened pieces of dough molded like tiny men with crossed arms, no icing, no sugar, but unmistakably human in outline. They were buried beside the dead as companions for the soul's voyage. Further east, in Mesopotamia, the cradle of urban civilization, ovens glowed inside ziggurat complexes. Clay tablets list offerings of sweet bread in human form for the goddess Ishtar during the spring rites. One line even mentions adding ginger, a spice arriving via caravans from India. These weren't treats for children. They were offerings meant to awaken divine favor, to embody life and sweetness in the midst of ceremony. When the ritual was over, the remaining figures were eaten by participants, a gesture believed to transfer the blessing inward. In the Indus Valley and later in Vedic rituals of India, sweets made with flour, honey, and ghee, sometimes molded into people or animals, played a role in temple festivals. Though not directly linked to gingerbread, they reveal a shared impulse across cultures to shape food into the image of the sacred and to ingest it as part of a story bigger than one meal. Anthropologists call this edible symbolism, a practice as old as agriculture itself. By the time spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger reached the Mediterranean, they carried with them the aura of far-off lands. In Greece and Rome, sacrificial cakes evolved into more elaborate confections. Some scholars point to melituta, a honey cake given to initiates in mystery cults, as a predecessor to gingerbread. Others see parallels in placenta, a layered pastry offered at temples. The thread running through all these examples is not the exact recipe, but the idea. Shaping dough into a figure, infusing it with sweet spice, and linking it to a ritual moment. When the Roman Empire stretched into northern Europe, its soldiers and merchants brought spices and customs with them. In Celtic and Germanic territories, bread effigies already existed in harvest and solstice ceremonies, little corn dolls, baked from the first or last sheaf of grain. The infusion of exotic spices gave these figures new prestige, and the stories surrounding them began to shift. Instead of simply embodying the spirit of the harvest, some legends whispered that the figures themselves could run away if not properly blessed, carrying the season's luck with them. That seed of narrative would later sprout as the runaway gingerbread man. Medieval Europe became the melting pot where these threads converged. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land brought back ginger, cardamom, and recipes for spiced breads. Monks in cloisters experimented with gingerbread as a medicinal treat, shaping it into saints, kings, or mythical creatures. During fairs, vendors sold honey cakes stamped with human forms, sometimes decorated with gold leaf. What began as a sacred ritual had become a popular spectacle, yet the echoes of its older meaning lingered. Even the word gingerbread in early English meant preserved ginger, not a cookie. Its transformation into a folk figure was still to come. By placing the gingerbread man back into this global tapestry, we see more than a whimsical cookie. We see the migration of a symbol, from temple altar to street fair, from offering to amusement, carrying bits of belief with every step. The world that birthed it was a crossroads of spice, story, and ritual, a world where making a man out of dough could link you to gods, ancestors, and the turning of the seasons. If we lean closer to the oldest surviving texts, faint but legible on clay tablets and parchment scraps, we begin to hear a whisper of stories about food that walked. In Mesopotamia, one fragment of a temple hymn refers to the blessed loaf that carries the breath of life. Scholars debate whether this was poetic language or a literal belief that a ritual bread figure held a spirit. In Egypt, some funerary spells speak of figures of flour and honey, set at the threshold to guard the deceased, then consumed to take their power within. These are not nursery tales, but glimpses of a worldview where shapes and substances intertwined. Across the Indo-European migrations, an oral motif appears again, the effigy that escapes. Folklorists trace it in Slavic, Baltic, and Germanic regions centuries before printed books. In one Belarusian tale recorded by 19th-century ethnographers, but clearly much older, a honey-cake boy leaps from a peasant woman's oven and runs through the village, taunting pursuers before meeting a trickster fox by the river. In a Norwegian version, a porridge cake man does the same. In West Africa, griots tell of the spirit cake that tests villagers' honesty. Each culture changes the ingredients, but the outline stays. A small, edible being, freedom-loving, quick, proud, eventually undone by cunning. Linguists notice a pattern in the refrains used in these tales, rhythmic, sing-song lines easy to remember. Run, run, as fast as you can, or its local equivalent. Such refrains likely date back to oral storytelling around hearths and markets, where repetition signaled a tale worth keeping. This also explains why the runaway motif could travel so far without writing. It was embedded in performance, in memory, in the mouths of countless tellers. Medieval miracle plays added another layer. In some guild performances of St. Nicholas and St. Martin festivals, Bakers produced spiced men of dough to hand out to children after the show. One sermon from 15th century Alsace warns against giving too much life to such figures, hinting at a superstition that if a child played with the figure instead of eating it promptly, it could turn mischief. Whether that was clergy humor or genuine folk fear, it reveals a lingering belief in the animated bread man. Hidden translations also shaped the story. The German Lebkuchenmann literally means life cake man. In Old English dialects, gingerbread was gingerbras or gingerbras, derived from a French word meaning preserved ginger. When these terms crossed, their meanings blended, life cake plus spiced bread. By the 17th century, English printers were putting out chapbooks with woodcut illustrations of a smiling, running cookie, an image already primed by centuries of myth. One might ask, why did the idea of a runaway edible figure resonate so deeply? Anthropologists suggest it dramatizes a universal tension between creation and autonomy. We shape dough, but once baked it becomes something else. In myth, that something else acquires a will of its own. Like golems, homunculi, or even later robots, the gingerbread figure embodies the wish and fear of the maker, to create life, to lose control of it, and to watch it flee. This background turns the gingerbread man from a simple folktale into a prism of older beliefs. Every bite of its story is layered. Ritual bread from temples, oral tales of animated food, medieval spiced men, and printed chapbooks merging languages and images. When you next hear the catchy refrain of the cookie who ran away, you're hearing echoes of 3,000 years of migration, ritual, and cautionary fun. Behind every culture's version of the gingerbread figure stands a cast of recurring characters, mythic archetypes who give the little cookie its personality. At first glance, it's just a sweet treat with a smile, but when you compare stories from Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Americas, patterns emerge. The gingerbread man is not only dough and spice. He is a miniature hero, a trickster, and sometimes a sacrificial offering rolled into one. In many early European tales, the edible figure represents the harvest spirit. Farmers bake the first or last sheaf of grain into a human shape to thank the fields and ensure fertility for the coming year. In this role, the bread man is not rebellious but reverent, embodying abundance. When eaten by the community, he symbolically returns strength to the people. This archetype still lingers in rural festivals, where bread dolls are shared at solstice or harvest time. As stories evolved, especially in the colder northern climates where oral tradition thrived, the bread man began to act more like a runaway child. He escapes the oven, boasting of his speed, challenging animals and people alike. Folklorists link this to the archetype of the trickster, a figure who tests boundaries, mocks authority, and ultimately exposes the limits of pride. In West African parallels, the spirit cake that flees the village behaves like Anansi the spider or the hare of Bantu tales, clever, playful, but destined to meet its match. Then there's the predator archetype, often embodied by a fox or a wolf. This animal is not simply hungry, it is cunning, the mirror image of the cookie's bravado. In the oldest Slavic variants, the fox represents winter itself, the inevitable end of the harvest season, swallowing the spirit of the grain, so that it can be reborn in spring. In Christianized versions, the fox sometimes stands for temptation or sin, catching the prideful loaf who thought he could outrun fate. Some regional tales introduce a helper figure, an old woman, a child, or a talking animal, who warns the bread man or tries to guide him. This echoes the archetype of the wise elder, a staple of myth from Homer to the Brothers Grimm. Yet in gingerbread stories, the helper is often ignored, highlighting the theme of willful independence. Cross-cultural comparison reveals fascinating overlaps. The golem of Jewish folklore, molded from clay and animated by a sacred word, shares the motif of a created being that may escape control. The Aztec tradition of Tzoali effigies, figures made of amaranth and honey offered to gods, then broken and eaten, also resonates. Even in modern Japan, kashi ninjyo, sweet dolls, are given at festivals and sometimes floated down rivers, as if to send a spirit away. By naming these archetypes, the harvest spirit, the runaway child, the trickster, the cunning predator, the ignored helper, we see that the gingerbread man is more than a nursery rhyme character. He carries within him a cast of ancient symbolic roles, compressed into one spiced figure. This explains why the story appeals to children and adults alike. It is a simple chaste tale on the surface, but a tapestry of timeless patterns underneath. And so, when the little cookie runs, we are not just amused. We are watching a miniature drama of creation, rebellion, pursuit, and consequence. A drama that our ancestors once played out with ritual bread and whispered incantations. Picture a frostbitten village on the edge of a dense medieval forest. It's late autumn, and the last harvest sheaves are stacked against timber walls. Inside a low-roofed cottage, an old woman kneads dark rye dough mixed with honey, ginger, and a pinch of precious cloves saved from a pilgrim's pouch. Her hands are practiced. She presses the dough into a wooden mold carved like a little man with wide eyes and outstretched arms. As she seals the edges, she murmurs a rhyme learned from her grandmother, a blend of blessing and warning. When the cottage oven's stone mouth glows red, she slides the figure inside. The scent of spice fills the single room. But when she opens the door to check, the shape leaps from the tray onto the floorboards. Its crust is crisp, its surface glistens, and it already has a voice. "I am warm, I am whole, I am free," it sings. Before she can react, it darts under the door and out into the cold dusk. The woman grabs her shawl and follows, calling for help. Chickens scatter as the small brown figure races past the henhouse. A pig squeals and gives chase, but the gingerbread man chants, "Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man." The rhythm is contagious. Villagers hear and repeat the lines as they join the pursuit. The cookie's path becomes a spiral through the settlement, past the mill where a donkey brays, over a frozen brook where geese flap their wings, into the snowy road leading to the forest. One by one, animals and people fall behind. The donkey's hooves slip, the geese tire, the miller gasps for breath. The cookie never slows, taunting each pursuer with a new verse. Children laugh, adults shake their heads, yet they keep running. What began as a kitchen mishap has turned into a communal chase, a ritual drama echoing the seasons, creation fleeing consumption, winter outrunning autumn. At the forest's edge waits a fox, sleek and patient. In some versions it's a wolf, in others a cunning old man, but the archetype is the same, the clever predator. The gingerbread man pauses, unsure how to cross the icy river. The fox offers his back. "Climb on, little man, and I will carry you." The cookie hesitates, but pride wins. It hops onto the fox's tail. Midstream, the fox says the water is rising and urges him onto his back, then his head. Just as the opposite bank comes near, the fox tosses his snout, and snap, the chase ends. In a breath, the villagers arrive, seeing only crumbs floating downstream. Some sigh, some smile, some cross themselves. The old woman kneels, scoops a fragment of spice from the water, and whispers another rhyme. The fox disappears into the trees, carrying the grain spirit, the season's luck, or simply a morsel of sugar, depending on who tells the story. This mini-film of a runaway cookie is more than entertainment. It encodes a cycle: sowing, reaping, baking, sharing, losing, and starting anew. The fox's mouth is winter. The crumbs are seeds for spring. Even if listeners don't know the symbolism, they feel its rhythm, the excitement, the inevitable turn, the quiet after the chase. This is why the story persists, why it can still hold an audience's breath centuries later. If the runaway cookie of the medieval village feels familiar, its cousins in other lands show just how far and wide the motif spread. In the Highlands of Scotland, there's a 17th century ballad about a bannock boy, baked from oat flour and honey, who leaps off the griddle and races across heather fields. Instead of a fox, it is a crafty old crow who tricks him at the riverbank, swallowing the bannock with a caw said to echo the winter wind. The refrain differs, but the pattern is the same: escape, pride, pursuit, cunning, and an ending that folds the tale back into the cycle of the seasons. Across the Baltic, Latvian storytellers spoke of the pepperkaka man, a spiced cake figure made at the solstice. In some villages, he doesn't run away at all. Instead, he walks in a procession carried by children before being shared. Here the ending is communal rather than predatory. a reminder that the edible spirit can return to the people voluntarily rather than through capture. Folklorists think this reflects a softer winter climate and a different ritual emphasis, continuity over conflict. Further south in Italy, medieval bakers created pan di zenzero figures for Epiphany markets. In one local legend recorded near Siena, the bread man flees not because he's proud, but because he carries a message for the Christ child, only to be intercepted by a raven who steals the letter hidden in his dough. The tale ends not with consumption, but with a moral about secrecy and trust, echoing the religious atmosphere of the time. Even outside Europe, parallels surface. In some West African stories, a sweet millet cake shaped like a child tests the honesty of villagers. It visits each hut, asking for hospitality, rewarding the kind, and fleeing from the greedy until it meets a trickster animal. In the Cherokee tradition of North America, there are faint echoes of a cornbread spirit that wanders before returning to the hearth to bless the household. These versions swap ingredients, animals, and morals, but they retain the core image of animated food and a journey that ends in transformation. What's striking is how each region adapts the characters to its own landscape. Fox becomes crow, river becomes canyon, honey becomes sorghum, wheat becomes maize. Yet the emotional beats, the surprise of animation, the thrill of escape, the tension of pursuit, the twist of betrayal or return, remain recognizable. It's as though cultures on opposite sides of the world were working from a shared template, tweaking details to fit their climate, crops, and fears. Anthropologists call this a migratory legend, one that travels along trade routes and adapts like a seed carried in a merchant's pouch. Spices did the same. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves moved from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, Europe, and eventually the Americas, infusing local breads with new scents. With each infusion, the legend gained a new accent, a new costume, but kept its bones. By exploring these alternate versions, we see how the Gingerbread Man isn't a single story, but a family of stories, each one a snapshot of a culture's relationship with creation, appetite, and fate. Some end in a fox's jaws, others in a child's hands, but all circle back to the question that began our journey. Why do we give food a face, and why do we imagine it running away? Every detail of the gingerbread figure carries a language older than writing. The shape of its arms, the number of its buttons, the spices in its dough. All of these are echoes of symbols that once had clear meaning to the people who made them. When we peel back the sugary surface, we find a coded vocabulary of protection, fertility, and transformation. Start with the human shape itself. In agrarian societies, bread was life. Shaping it into a person wasn't whimsy. It was a way of acknowledging that grain and human destiny were intertwined. The dough figure stood as a miniature of the community, the spirit of the harvest made visible. Eating it was a symbolic way of taking that spirit back into the body, renewing the cycle. Then there are the arms and legs stretched wide, a pose seen in prehistoric carvings from Europe to India. Some scholars believe it represents openness to blessing or a stance of running, depending on the culture. Either way, the posture radiates energy, movement, and vitality, qualities you would want in a new season's crops or in a protective charm. The buttons or decorations are not just for looks. In some German regions, bakers pressed 3 currants into the chest to echo the Trinity. In pagan contexts, 3 dots represented birth, life, and death. In Scandinavian versions, 5 seeds might symbolize the 5 senses or 5 major stars visible at solstice. Even the zigzag of icing along the limbs recalls protective markings found on ancient amulets. Spices carry their own symbolism. Ginger arrived from South Asia as both flavor and medicine. In medieval Europe, it was considered warming, a guard against winter chills and sluggishness of the blood. Cinnamon evoked the exotic East and was linked to wealth and status. Cloves were thought to banish evil spirits and freshen the breath, practical and magical at once. Combining these spices into one dough turned the cookie into a miniature apothecary, a protective blend eaten at the darkest time of year. Animals in the story also speak symbolically. The fox or crow that ends the chase stands for cunning, winter, and inevitability. The pig or cow that tries and fails to catch the cookie evokes ordinary appetite, the community's hunger for the harvest spirit. The river that the gingerbread man cannot cross marks the boundary between this world and the next. Crossing it without proper help means dissolution. Crossing it with the fox means surrender to the cycle. Even the act of running carries meaning. In some interpretations, the cookie's dash from the oven mirrors the soul's flight from the body or the sun's retreat at winter solstice. Its boastful refrain dramatizes the tension between freedom and fate, between the desire to escape consumption and the inevitability of being reabsorbed. When we view the gingerbread man through this lens, every bite becomes a ritual, even if we no longer think of it that way. The shape, the spices, the chase, they're all fragments of a shared symbolic language that once guided people through the seasons, the mysteries of life and death, and the hope for renewal. Modern bakers may add candy eyes and frosting smiles, but underneath lies a template thousands of years old, whispering meanings we feel more than we know. Though most people now encounter the gingerbread man as a whimsical cookie or a picture book character, the legend's old bones still peek through in modern life. Every December in Europe and North America, bakeries and homes fill with the smell of spiced dough cut into human shapes. We think of them as holiday treats, but the timing, deep winter, at the turning of the year, matches the ancient solstice rituals that first birthed them. Language carries the echoes too. In German, Lebkuchen still means life cake. In Sweden and Norway, pepperkaka literally translates as pepper cake, a nod to the exotic spices, once worth more than gold. In some rural English counties, elderly people still call gingerbread men fairings, because they were originally sold at medieval fairs as charms for lovers. The cookie was meant to be eaten by two people at once to seal affection, a distant cousin of the fertility symbolism once baked into harvest loaves. Holiday markets preserve even older customs. In Nuremberg's Christkindlmarkt, bakers still stamp giant gingerbread hearts with names and messages, selling them as tokens of luck. In Eastern Europe, intricate honey cakes shaped like saints and animals are blessed by priests before being eaten at Epiphany. In Mexico, muñecos de pan, bread dolls, appear for the Day of the Dead and the Feast of the Epiphany, linking bread figures to remembrance and renewal rather than escape. Each of these practices shows how the edible effigy adapts to new religious calendars, but keeps its symbolic charge. Popular culture has taken the legend in playful directions. Children's books in the 19th and 20th centuries cemented the runaway cookie motif in English-speaking countries, turning it into a moral tale about pride and obedience. Animation studios gave the gingerbread man new life as a comic character. Shrek's defiant cookie, for instance, winking at the audience while echoing the old run, run refrain. Even video games and advertising use the figure as shorthand for speed, spice, or nostalgia. Psychologists note that the story appeals because it is simple enough for a child to follow, yet layered enough for adults to sense its archetypes. A being we create rebels, runs, and is caught. A cycle familiar from parenting, innovation, and even social change. At Christmas parties, children laugh at the idea of a cookie escaping the oven. Parents smile at the memory of the chase as they bite into its crisp edge. Without knowing it, both are participating in a tradition 3,000 years old. Modern bakers also experiment with shapes beyond the classic man. Women, animals, mythical creatures, even custom portraits. Yet the default outline, a running person with arms out, remains iconic. It's instantly readable, instantly linked to the tale, much like the silhouette of Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. This persistence shows how deeply the motif has lodged in the collective mind. So the next time you see a tray of gingerbread men cooling on a kitchen counter or stacked at a market stall, you're looking at more than a cookie. You're looking at a living fragment of world folklore, a festival of spice and story that has survived empires, religions, and continents. It's one of the few myths you can hold in your hand, decorate with icing, and then eat, transforming legend back into sustenance, just as our ancestors once did. Looking at the gingerbread man through an anthropologist's lens reveals how a playful cookie sits at the intersection of ritual, psychology, and global trade. The story of a runaway bread figure is not just a quaint folktale, but a living case study in how myths adapt to human needs and how food carries meaning beyond nutrition. Anthropologists studying edible effigies, Note that shaping food into people, animals, or spirits is nearly universal. Archaeological digs from the Nile to the Andes show breads and cakes molded into figures long before written language. These finds tell us that people were symbolically consuming what they hoped to become: strong, fertile, protected, or ritually sending offerings away in a digestible form. In this sense, the gingerbread man is part of a much larger human behavior, using food to enact stories about life, death, and renewal. Religious historians point out that many traditions, from the Greek Pelenoi to the Aztec Tzoali, from the Christian Eucharist to modern holiday breads, rely on a shared logic: make, bless, break, and eat. The act unites a community and transmits a belief physically. When that belief fades, the form often survives as a custom stripped of explicit doctrine, but still carrying an emotional charge. That's exactly what we see with the gingerbread figure: its sacred context lost, its shape and season retained. Psychologists studying children's responses to the gingerbread man find that the story's chase sequence maps neatly onto developmental themes: autonomy, risk-taking, consequence. A cookie that runs away dramatizes a child's impulse to test boundaries and the world's response. The inevitable capture by the fox reassures listeners that boundaries exist, but the brief adventure celebrates curiosity and speed. Adults may laugh at the cookie's bravado, but at some level, they are watching a myth about themselves, the pride of creation, the thrill of rebellion, and the return to order. Food historians add another dimension: the spice trade. Without ginger, cinnamon, and cloves traveling thousands of miles from Asia to Europe, there would be no gingerbread as we know it. Each bite contains a history of caravans, ships, and markets. The high price of spices in the Middle Ages gave spiced breads an aura of luxury and ritual. Over time, mass trade and colonization made spices affordable, and the ritual treat became a household cookie. Yet the sense of occasion persists. Most people still bake gingerbread seasonally, not daily, preserving its festive aura. Modern nutrition science even gives a small nod to tradition. Ginger contains compounds like gingerol that warm the body and soothe the stomach. Cinnamon and cloves have mild antimicrobial effects. Medieval people didn't know the chemistry, but intuited that these spices protected them in winter. Combining them in a bread figure at the year's turning was both symbolic and, in a small way, practical. When myth meets science, we see a full picture. A ritual practice that began as a way to embody the seasons and solicit blessings evolved into a folktale of a runaway cookie, then into a holiday treat. Each layer, archaeology, anthropology, psychology, food history, confirms that the gingerbread man is more than nostalgia. It is a living artifact of how humans use story and food to navigate time, change, and community. Across temples and kitchens, across languages and empires, the gingerbread man has carried a story older than its frosting smile. What began as a sacred effigy in honeyed dough became a runaway in folktales, then a nursery rhyme hero, and finally a holiday cookie. Each stage of its journey reflects a piece of us: our rituals, our migrations, our need to give shape to the unseen, and to taste our myths. When you hold a gingerbread man in your hand, you're holding more than sugar and spice. You're holding a miniature map of human history. The early farmers who shaped bread into people to honor the harvest, the merchants who ferried ginger and cinnamon across oceans, the storytellers who turned edible charms into legends of freedom and fate, and the parents who passed those tales to children at winter's edge. The cookies dashed from the oven may be make-believe, but the forces that shaped it, trade, ritual, imagination, are entirely real. The legend also reminds us of something subtle yet powerful. The moment we create something, it takes on a life of its own. Whether a loaf of bread, a story, a song, or a new idea, once it leaves our hands it travels, adapts, and becomes part of other lives. The gingerbread man dramatizes that truth with a wink and a sprint, making it safe for children to learn and satisfying for adults to contemplate. And in a world that often feels disconnected from roots and seasons, this small spiced figure still ties us to cycles of making, sharing, and letting go. We bake it at the darkest time of the year, decorate it with symbols we hardly recognize, tell a story whose refrain we've forgotten is ancient, and in doing so we participate in a tradition 3,000 years in the making. It is folklore you can smell, touch, and taste, a ritual hiding in plain sight. So the next time a gingerbread man emerges from your oven or appears on a market stall, take a moment before biting off its arm. Hear the echo of a temple hymn, a village chase, a caravan bell, a medieval fair. Remember that you are part of an unbroken chain of hands shaping dough into meaning. That is the secret behind the gingerbread man. A humble cookie as a vessel of memory, a runaway story that keeps returning, sweet and spiced, reminding us who we've been and who we still are.